Welcome again, everybody. Let's crack on. This is the third in our climate talk series. We can announce the next two events. So on Friday, April the 3rd, we'll be talking with Barry Linham, who's Managing Director of Knauf Energy Solutions, about how the building materials sector and the energy service companies can be part of the renovation wave as part of the European Green Deal. And then next week on Tuesday, April the 7th, we have Elena Wisnar-Malinowska, who's a head of unit in DG Klima, responsible for adaptation. So we're going to have a slightly different take on the Green Deal and look at how countries and governments are actually going to deal with some of the effects of climate change that are headed our way. Decarbonization efforts. Today's guest is Kai Luecke. Kai is Senior Vice President for External Relations at ZF Group. You may not know ZF Group. It's actually a huge global technology company with its headquarters in Friedrichshafen, and it supplies systems to the automotive sector. It has around 150,000 employees worldwide, Kai, if I'm not mistaken, and 270 plants in Europe, but also in Brazil, China, and really worldwide. We also have joining us Peter Vis, who many of you will know by now, Senior Advisor here at Ruud Pedersen. Peter is a former head of cabinet to the first European Commissioner for Climate Action, Connie Hedegaard, and served in the cabinet of one of the energy commissioners. As always, we're looking for and want to encourage a very interactive session. So we invite you and urge you to send your questions via the chat function, which you can find in the little menu box on the right-hand side. The chat will be the questions that come in. If I can, Joanna, just want to introduce yourself to the audience. Oh, you've muted your microphone.
I'm now. Hi, this is Joanna. I'm a consultant in Ruud Pedersen, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat when you can send your questions. They say it goes to admin, but I'm able to see them, and I will read out some of them at relevant points.
Great. Joanna will also be in charge of telling us the results of the polls. We have some more online polls that we started doing in the last session with Ostel Becker and Peter. Would work very well. So what we're going to do is we're going to open the first poll now and invite you to start voting. Can you put that up or no? Do people need to go into it? I can't quite remember, Joanna. If you click on the box on the right, you will get a poll option. Okay, it's there. Sure. So the question is, should governments help the European automobile industry to overcome the economic impact of the coronavirus? And you can see the choices. Yes, unconditionally. Yes, but only with conditions that drive decarbonisation, and then no. So we'll read out the results once we've had a discussion here. So Kai, let me come to you first of all. What is the coronavirus doing to the industry, both short term, immediately, and what do you expect the impact to be sort of longer term?
Great, thanks for having me, and thanks for Ruud Pedersen for organizing this. I think the impact, both short term and long term, will be very severe. So both in terms of the economics impact at the moment, the economic impact in the medium term, but also the political impact in the long term. I think all of this will be very significant. At the moment, the European automotive industry is virtually at a standstill. So a number of automotive manufacturers have closed their plants for a number of weeks. For us as a supplier, this of course also means that our plants are closed or virtually closed, with a huge number of people in short-time work, chômage technique, Kurzarbeit, whatever you call it, because at the moment it's a liquidity issue. So we continue to have costs, but virtually no entries, or only entries that were the result from activities over the last weeks and months. And this is a significant deterioration also compared to the financial crisis 2009. So I think in the short term, very significant, lots of short-term work. If you look at our company, not only in plants, but also in the headquarters, also for our functions in Berlin and Brussels offices, we have reduced dramatically because we need to cut costs at this stage.
So you mentioned the 2008 financial crisis, which of course, during which the automotive industry got government support. What kind of, I mean, everyone is expecting some kind of support to be asked for and probably to be forthcoming. What do you think that could look like? And of course, we are, will it be financial? Will it be, do you expect to take the form of scrappage schemes? And then we can, do you want to answer that? And then we can talk about sort of the regulatory timetable as well.
Sure. So I think there are different stages. Now in the immediate crisis situation, from an economic point of view, it's a liquidity issue. So there are a number of measures that were taken. European Central Bank with a pandemic emergency purchase program. There are a number of measures taken at national level. It's a liquidity issue. Short-term work greatly helps there as well. But additional measures, for example, delaying tax payment, can also help to safeguard liquidity. That's really what needs to be done at this very moment. But from our point of view, we should also start preparing again, ramping up the economy. What does this mean? Very practically, we need to discuss now. And even if we don't discuss now, do we ramp up again in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 5 weeks? That's too early to tell. But what we can say is that we need to start discussing the conditions for ramp up so that we ramp up in a responsible way. What are the protective measures for our employees? What are the requirements for wearing masks in production sites, for distancing also in production sites, etc.? These are the things we should be starting to discuss now, because economically the standstill can't go on forever. And of course, we need to bring back people to buy cars. And there, at the moment, so we have the immediate liquidity issue, but also now nobody, hardly anybody, goes to car dealers to buy cars. So we can already foresee a certain problem coming up in a few months. So definitely we need to talk about measures to kickstart the economy. The 2008-9 crisis with the scrappage scheme gives us a certain indication what has worked well. I don't think we need to necessarily copy this, but I think we should learn from that crisis what worked well. And yes, we need measures.
Okay, Peter, you've lived through at least one financial crisis of one description or another. Well, what's your experience of what lessons can be drawn from what was done last time and what you think should be done this time?
Well, we did have quite a similar debate about 10 years ago when the financial crisis was unfolding, 2009, 2010, when there were grave problems in the banking sector and indeed in some states of the European Union. And one of the things we argued then, and I think it's true today as well, is that in trying to relaunch economic activity, we must do things that are compatible with our long-term agendas, i.e., in this particular context, the European Green Deal. And I think those two things are compatible. So yes, there's obviously a clear willingness to help on the part of governments, central banks and national banking sectors and so on. The liquidity is, they're doing, I think, what they can do. And the Commission too is easing the rules regarding state aid in order to facilitate the sorts of immediate short-term aid that are likely to be needed in these circumstances. But the longer-term question is that we mustn't change course. There are still big issues to resolve, and climate change is one that is not going to go away. And the important thing is not to be doing things that in some way obstruct our efforts to address the climate in an adequate way. And I think that's the sort of conditionality we can already see being discussed, and indeed what I think the Commission is likely to do. Yeah.
So, Kai, I mean, one thing we've seen from the industry side, there's a letter from ASEA, the car makers, the automotive sector, Klepper, the car parts suppliers, and other parts of the industry have written to the Commission and said there's a lot of planned legislation and laws coming down the track. And they said to the Commission, I assume that you're a signatory to this as a member of Klepper, some adjustment would need to be made to the timing of these laws, and without calling into question their purpose and the direction. Is that the view of the industry, that we can stay on track, but the coronavirus crisis calls for a major rethink of the timetable?
Yeah, I think that there are two elements there. One is, let's say, there are a number of things that are being planned and that now, due to the health situation, may be delayed. And I think these are really common sense issues. So, for example, for some regulations, we need implementing legislation. We need technical specifications coming from the UNECE in Geneva. Are they going to meet? Which type of working groups are meeting to specify technical requirements? So does industry, by the way, have the capacity to even contribute to those at the moment because of short-term work? There are a number of consultations going on. Can we actually give input to those? So I think there are a number of common sense issues that where I think we will need to make adjustments. There's a second debate, what does it mean fundamentally for regulation? And I think that's a more difficult debate. My hypothesis is that for 2050, as Peter says, the climate challenge remains the same. I think there will be little or no change when it comes to the objective of 2050, new climate deal, Green Deal, etc. Where I think the discussion will be fundamentally different is what about the nearer term? What about 2030? I think we will have a fundamentally different discussions 4 weeks ago and in 4 months. And I think the severity of this impact hasn't fully bust into the Brussels bubble, simply because we have a number of transmission belts between the real economy and Brussels. So companies are affected first, then also public affairs departments will be affected second, then associations will be affected, but in a much more indirect way, and then the European Commission. Think who's now in short-term work in the European Commission? I would assume very few. So I think the severity of this impact, it will take some time to be registered fully in Brussels. I'm really in no hurry. I don't think it's the discussion we need to have at the moment. This discussion will take place because the budget constraints of governments, of companies, and of end consumers will be different, just factually different next year than we thought they would be just a few weeks ago.
Do you think, Kai, that obviously we've had the Dieselgate, the defeat devices issue? Do you think that's changed the? I mean, obviously the automotive sector is a huge employer, a huge generator of innovation, but there's been a loss of goodwill from the public. Is that? How do you think that will play out in the debates that we're going to have?
Yeah, certainly the scandal has fundamentally changed the reputation of the industry, and both in the eyes of the public and in decision makers. And I mean, I can't complain about that. Yeah. So there were huge mistakes made, and so clear. Still, that doesn't mean that we should now, as society overall, see how we can get this industry as the engine of the European economy going again. And I think that's a discussion that is separate from the scandals of the past. And still, the scandals have an impact, and they will have an impact. But really, I think we all now have an interest in getting this sector going again, and other sectors as well.
Okay, Peter, as a policymaker, how do you assess the how will they be thinking inside the institutions confronted with these kind of issues?
Well, I think there are always issues going on that will be of relevance to the policymaking processes. 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, when we were discussing a low carbon roadmap for 2050, the Commission came out with the communication in 2011 on the 8th of March, and then on the 11th of March of that same year, there was the nuclear accident at Fukushima in Japan. And of course, then there was a moving away from nuclear power in Germany that relatively soon followed that. And this obviously had very great repercussions on the climate change debate and the climate change performance of Europe, because what happened in Germany was that nuclear was being replaced by solid fuel power generation in a large part. So there isn't a stable context in which to make policy. It's a dynamic context, and this situation we're in today is certainly a very, very severe one, a serious one. But when we're talking about carbon neutrality in 2050, which is the debate of the day, that's the climate law has been proposed. Well, as Kai says, industry seemingly doesn't really have a problem with the climate neutrality objective in 2050, if I understand right. And that is what we need to commit to in the short term. And by way of other regulatory policy making, there are things in the pipeline. There is most immediately the question of what sort of reduction target we would set in 2030.
Sure.
We've had that debate before. We've settled on 40%, but there's now a discussion of taking it much further. That's not going to be likely to be sort of taken further in a substantive way until after the summer, by which time I would hope we'll be seeing a different situation than today with regards to the coronavirus. And then the laws that would perhaps be revisited in the climate area, such as the CO2 performance standards for cars or the energy taxations, these are all being implemented in a longer timescale for next year in most cases. And that's therefore the earliest that the Commission could have a formed opinion on what changes might be called for. So things are not going to be happening immediately. And I think once the short-term crisis we're in is easing a little bit, I hope, as everyone hopes, then I think we can have continue a calm debate about those measures.
Okay, good. I'm going to change the subject in a minute to talk about fuel sources and technology. Just before we do that, do we have any good questions from the floor? And then, Joanna, and then we'll have from the floor, from the online room. And then we'll maybe it'll be a good time to look at the results of the first poll. Joanna?
Yes, we have a question coming in from Niels Russell from Male, who says that there are considerations to use the EU taxonomy to determine where support should go. Do you consider this a sensible approach, or what should policymakers use as a guidance?
So I think that's to you, Kai. Do you understand the reference to taxonomy? And great. So could you explain it to our audience who are maybe not as familiar? This is the sustainable finance issue. Could you, before you answer the question, could you just fill in our the broader the people who might not know what the taxonomy is?
I'm sure I'm not the best person to explain this, but my understanding is that sustainable finance identifies a certain number of activities as green or as not green, and so trying to push some activities rather than others. Yeah. So now the question, if I understand correctly, is should this be a basis for where we give support? So again, I think at the moment, really in the very short term, it's about liquidity. Let's avoid that we have huge economic costs later, because now certain sectors, areas, companies, from from large to small might not make it through the crisis. So I think that's our first objective, liquidity. Then let's get the economy going again, and let's do that in a responsible way with safety measures for the employees in plants and with sensible measures for which type of activities we want to ramp up and which kind of products maybe we want to support. And there, I also see, as Peter says, and maybe Niels, which is maybe implied in your question, that we can do some things, kill two birds with one stone, or rather help two birds with one stone, maybe. That we that we support also activities that give a double dividend in terms of the Green Deal. Where that's the case, great. I'm not sure that will be the main concern of all governments if you look at some markets at the moment. But yes, where that's the case, let's do it. And I give you a clear example. Let's look at the electric charging infrastructure. We need much more of it anyway. So absolutely fine. Let's build electric charging infrastructure. Let's make sure that people can maybe more easily install that in their homes. And that will benefit the Green Deal, and it will benefit economic activity. So should that be the only consideration? No, I don't think so. But where we can have a double dividend, let's use it.
Okay, great. Joanna, let's can you share this with the poll results, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
Yes. So the question was if governments should help the European automobile industry to overcome the economic impact of coronavirus. And 70% of our listeners are saying yes, but only with conditions that drive the decarbonization of the road transport sector. 25% say yes unconditionally, and 3% say no, not at all.
The question's a little bit motherhood and apple pie, but interesting to see the clear lead of the answer with conditionality. Joanna, could you launch the second question so that people can vote online? The fuel, okay, because we're going to move on to talk about the fuel source now, the fuel source and the technology. So I think in many ways the future of the transport sector is largely a question of what fuel source and what engine technology we might use. So you see we have a poll there with liquid hydrocarbon fuels, e-fuels, electricity, and hybrid. Kai, where do you see the way forward, and do you think the EU is being technology neutral in its approach, or?
Actually, I don't think they are, but let's discuss that in a second. I'd like to come back to that.
Sure.
So the future is electric. I mean, we want to electrify everything from e-bikes to heavy trucks, but where we need to watch out is that electrification doesn't only mean one solution. So electrification doesn't mean only fully electric battery-powered cars. That would be a mistake. I think so. Electrification is the clear trend, and for many applications, electrification is a very sensible and useful approach. But full electrification is not necessarily the best approach for every application. And so in that sense, the discussion which we have in the media and in politics is always sometimes too black and white. And we are fundamentally convinced that sometimes gray is whiter than white, because there are many, many ways, hybridization, plug-in hybrids, that for many applications can play a much more sensible role than full electrification.
And why is that? Why is that more practical, or why is that more? Why not bite the bullet and go whole hog?
Yeah, so essentially, for urban transport, cars for the urban mobility, full electrification is really the sensible way. But if we want electrification to really be successful, and if we want to reach very, very ambitious climate targets, we need to bring electrification to the mainstream, out of the niche of those owning a second car. Now, if you own two cars, then it's very easy to have one fully electric car and one other car, and you use one for urban chores and one for going on holidays. Very simple. If we want, however, electrification to really conquer the mainstream, we need to think of other solutions. And what does a family that has one car, because they only want one car, because they can only afford one car, what do they need? And there, in our eyes, plug-in hybrids is the best solution. Why? Because with the next generation of plug-in hybrids, not those of today, but the next generation of plug-in hybrids, you can do 80, 100 kilometers fully electric. And if all of us think about our daily mobility needs, I think that will mean that nearly all our daily mobility will be fully electric. But with the same car, you can still go on holidays, visit granny on the weekend, and go skiing in the holidays. So that's the way how we drive electrification to the mass market. We can also avoid oversized batteries, which are a disaster in terms of costs and are also a challenge in terms of life cycle emissions. And think of the infrastructure. If you plan infrastructure for a world with BEVs only, fully electric cars, you need a layout for the charging infrastructure for the worst weekend in August when everybody is on the highway to Italy. Now, that is very unlikely to be a realistic scenario for the foreseeable future. So we need other solutions there. Plug-in hybrid is the answer.
Peter, you're a veteran of inside the Commission. At one stage, the Commission tried to promote a specific technology. I'm thinking of biofuels, setting a renewable target or a biofuel target. How do you design a policy for the decarbonisation of transport that doesn't seek to pick winners?
Okay. I think I would say that the Commission has never picked or defined a target in terms of only one technology. We did, for a while, support biofuels in the very early days. We supported biofuels, and they benefited from a presumption that they were good for the environment. And then since that, we have realized that there needed to be conditionalities applied to the biofuels. And so gradually the sustainability criteria were introduced, and all sorts of other safeguards, such that now the EU is promoting only the very best biofuels that would not have a indirect incentive to deforest rainforest in South America and so on, or have an indirect land use impact. But all of our targets have been 10%, for example, of renewable fuel in transport was for 2020. It wasn't saying what kind of renewable fuel. And I think the 2020 targets, the 2030 targets, and indeed some of the specific legislation like the CO2 standards for cars is trying to be technology neutral. And one of the points I would make is, while I like the idea of electrifying passenger cars, and certainly in an urban context, I think in practice we will see multiplication of technologies, but low carbon technologies. For example, the e-fuels that there's a question in the poll about them. By those we mean fuels without any climate impact, because they're made from renewable energy and waste CO2, for example, and they combine those to make a synthetic fuel that can be used not just in road transport, but in aviation potentially as well. Those kinds of things aren't necessarily harmful for the climate, but they're starting from a very, very small base, and perhaps they have a future in the hybrid scenario that Kai described, where you might want to have a hybrid car. So I think the Commission has tried very hard to maintain carbon neutrality. And I think that they can, I would say that they've done that as successfully as possible in these circumstances, yeah.
Yeah, sure, Kai.
I can just jump in there, because I think in a way what you said sums it up nicely. They're trying to be as technology neutral as possible. I think they don't really manage. Why do I say that? Legally, clearly, the CO2 standards are technology neutral, because in principle, whatever gets you the number is fine. In actual fact, the way you measure emissions, of course, can favor dramatically one technology over another. And that's also the case in our CO2 legislation. And I think that's a point that needs discussion, because if you only measure at the tailpipe, any technology that doesn't have a tailpipe is a wonderful technology, no matter what the life cycle impact is. And any technology that has tailpipe emissions, even if over the life cycle you have carbon neutrality, which is possible, of course, with carbon neutral fuels, is a bad technology. Now, and I think we need to change the system. Now, it doesn't mean that we need to badmouth electrification. Really, if that's not the objective here, to slow down electrification. Electrification has an important role to play. In the long run, it will be a very, very good climate solution. So absolutely fine. We don't need to make electrification worse, but I think we should open all paths to climate neutrality because we will need them. We will have electrification, but even in 2030, all serious predictions show that we will still have more than half of the cars with a combustion engine. Not only combustion engine, but with a combustion engine. So we need to open all paths to climate neutrality, and that the current framework does not do in my eyes.
Okay, great. I was going to invite you to talk about the poll results, Joanna, but before we do that, do we have any good questions on this topic?
Yes, we have a question coming in from Yomi Otobushin from BMW Group, which is saying that CO2 targets are set by EU legislation, taxation, infrastructure provision by the members. CO2 targets are set by EU legislation, taxation, infrastructure provision by the member states. This is a problem for the demand side of the alternative fueled vehicles. What are the options for streamlining legislation?
I think I've got to jump in there. I think legislation in reality is made by different bodies, different levels of governance. So the European level legislates, national level legislates, and in many cities there's a local competence to legislate access restrictions to the cities, for example. And what's important is that those different levels of governance all pull in the same direction. Then you get obviously the best effect. The European Union legislates on things where it thinks it really makes sense for reasons of the internal market, for example, to legislate at a pan-European level. That's why CO2 standards for cars have been done at the European level, because we could not easily envisage an EU where there were 27 different sets of standards, 28 if with the UK, because they're still effectively as if they're in the EU. So then the car manufacturers, if they had 28 different standards to comply with, depending on which market the car was destined for, they'd have a much more complex job. So there was a very clear case why standardization is generally done at the EU level because of the internal market. And we get the economies of scale with the internal market, which is of benefit to everybody. So I think the EU is doing its best, but we're not alone. We're trying, for example, in energy, in this particular space of transport, we do have a energy products directive, which legislates minimum rates of tax that are applied to fuels. And that is something that the European Commission has said it was going to revisit again. I think that's a very important piece of legislation, because fuel taxation is really a very well-adapted tool, and it basically means that you pay according to usage of a vehicle, and of course different types of fuel can get different rates of tax, such that you favor low carbon fuels might be given a tax exemption, for example, or a lower rate of tax. So you can differentiate between fuels, and the users pay according to distance driven, those are the sorts of things we should be doing in the European Union. They reflect the polluter pays principle. Now, it's true, most taxes are decided at the national level, and in case of these excise duties, all the EU does is it fixes minimum rates of taxation, and in practice, member states might go far above those minimum. But it's time to revisit that directive and move those minimum rates up very substantially. And that is something that the Commission intends to do. And I think it fits very well with all of the other policies that the Commission has in place. And indeed, the member states still have their element of discretion as to exactly how high they might put tax rates in the future.
Thanks, Peter. Kai, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, with pleasure. I also think, indeed, I agree with many of the things, and I also with the underlying message of the question that not everything is under the control of the car manufacturers. We need the CO2 standards. They will work if they work together with a product offering, but also with taxation and infrastructure progress. Now, and this is a challenge for the OEMs because the charging infrastructure.
It's the car makers, yeah.
Yes, sorry. Are very, very different from one country to the other. And also in terms of taxation, we have some good and some bad examples. Some bad examples where taxation was changed and all of a sudden the purchase of low emission vehicles was dramatically flatlining afterwards. So this is a challenge. Let me give a good example. Recently, Germany has just changed company car taxation to favor both electric vehicles, so fully electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, and they combine that with a range requirement. So they say, we will give plug-in hybrids the full tax benefit, but only if there's a certain minimum electric range. And I think that's a smart way of supporting both the CO2 compliance of the OEMs and contributing to the objectives of the Green Deal.
Okay, great. Let's have the results of the poll on this question. Then I'm going to move away from the automotive sector to look more broadly at the transport sector before coming back again at the end. So, Joanna, could you just share with us the results of the poll on the fuel source and technology question?
Yes. So that was the question, which will be the most prevalent of them in road vehicles in 2030. And the two options, electricity and hybrid, including plug-in, are 34% and 31%. And then we have following liquid hydrocarbon fuels. I just published the results as well. Liquid hydrocarbon fuels are at 23 and 10% e-fuels.
Great, thanks, Joanna. Could you put up the next poll? I want to take you out of your comfort zone a little bit now, Kai, and ask you to talk about the wider transport sector, because of course the demand for road vehicles and is not determined. Obviously, it competes against other transport modes, to use the correct term. We have a poll which is saying which transport sectors need to be more heavily regulated and taxed, and I think we have a very clear result already. But let's we have a lot of early votes for the aviation sector. What do you when you think about the automotive sector, Kai, in relation to others? Where do you see maybe not injustices, but where do you think there isn't a level playing field, or where the playing field could be made more level? And the options we have in the poll are automotive, rail, and aviation. But you're free to add your own, but I think those are the main ones.
No, I like the question. First of all, I think in a way, if you whichever sector you talk to in transport and outside transport, many sectors feel persecuted. Yeah, they'll feel, oh, we have to do so much. It's so unjust. Why don't the others do more? I think that's a very unhealthy state of mind, and it's also not a productive one to bring the debate forward. So now, so in that sense, I don't want to claim that we are unjustly persecuted at all. Every sector needs to do its share, and the transport sector, road transport, needs to contribute. Let me give you two examples where you can then make up your mind if what is fair or not. So if you look at the CO2 regulation, we have certain penalties for the car manufacturers of 95 euros per gram in case you're above the target. Now, this translates to around 500 euros per ton of CO2 penalty. I think objectively, you can compare that with other sectors and then ask yourself, is this so sensible? Is this such a sensible use of economic resources? That's number one. Number two is, again, trying to underline the point I tried to make earlier. We have at the moment a regulation in silos. We have an approach for the car manufacturers, and we have an approach for the fuel industry. What we really need is a holistic approach to create all paths to climate neutrality. This does not necessarily mean that we combine the two regulations, but we need a joint approach. And if we have a joint approach, I think we can also achieve very ambitious climate targets.
But then is a simple answer would a simple answer not be to include transport in the ETS? Maybe Peter, what's your
Well, I think that's something that's been put on the table by the European Green Deal communication. I have reservations about it because I do feel that, in fact, what would likely happen is not that every motorist would have a sort of certain amount of carbon credits to spend. And if you didn't have a car, you could perhaps sell your credits to someone else who did have a car. I think that isn't how transport would be brought into the emissions trading scheme. Much more likely is that fuel suppliers would have obligations put on them, and they would pass the cost through in the price of fuel to the final consumers. And if it's in the end, the effect of it is going to be the price at the pump, then there is an instrument that's already there for that, and that's called excise duties and fuel taxes, as they are known today. So I really think that the best way is to pursue that fuels taxation approach. I'm reserved about Kai's suggestion, though, of a holistic approach whereby you take the performance of the car in combination with the fuel, because obviously administratively that's a much more complex approach. But also, when you sell a car to a consumer, the consumer is the one who decides whether he buys a fossil fuel or an e-fuel, if they were going to be choosing between those two, if the choice was available. And the manufacturer wouldn't really have any say over those choices, just as the amount of miles driven or kilometers driven in a car is a choice that the consumer makes. And that's why I think it's good to tax fuel specifically and distinctly from the performance of the vehicle itself. So I think the architecture as it stands is good, and I think it will just need strengthening.
But you would favour including aviation fuel?
Yes. If I may, because we had a bit of this discussion at the last session with Professor Delbecq, I believe very firmly that the aviation sector needs to decarbonize, needs to become sustainable, and my preferred means of that is to require the aviation sector to use a certain percentage of e-fuels, these synthetic fuels that are made in such a way as to have no carbon footprint. Those fuels are in very scarce supply at the moment, and they would have to start at a very low percentage of blending now. But over time, we could perhaps increase those percentages in such a way that the aviation sector can aspire to become sustainable, because just imposing extra taxes on aviation will generate revenues and might slow demand for aviation, but it will not of itself make aviation sustainable. So yes, it should pay its fair share, and it certainly gets a very good deal at the moment from a tax exemption point of view. But I think that is also under review under the Green Deal. There is a suggestion that aviation might pay taxes on its fuel.
I'm keen to move on to the next topic, but this is a good point, I think, Joanna, to look at the results of the poll, because voting has evolved during the discussion. And then when you've told us about the poll, maybe if there's some good questions on this topic, we can round that off before we move to the final topic area.
The poll results, which I'm displaying right now, say that which transport sectors should be regulated and taxed more heavily, and aviation is still the winner with 63%. At 24%, there is the option all of the above, and automotive industry 12%.
I think because I saw the poll from the beginning, so the votes in favour of aviation peaked. They were initially over 70 and then have come down, and automotive, unfortunately, Kai, has increased during the votes. Now it went from very low levels to 12%. So, but you're not squarely in the sights of our voters today. Joanna.
from the audience, I can take us back from the aviation topic. There's a question from Jean-Arnaud Vinois from the Jacques Delors Institute, asking that if the individual car ownership of today is still needed in the paradigm of 2030.
Well, that's actually that's the next. Yeah, that's for the next section. So, could we maybe put that one on hold, and we'll go into the topic, and we can have that as the first question for the next round. So, Joanna, could you put the next poll up?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Ask a question. Go on, get me going.
So we wanted to round off to look at the question that Mr. Vinois has asked, really, about what is the future of car ownership. But actually, in order to get there, I wanted to actually first talk about autonomous driving and what potential that has to change car ownership patterns. And also to link back to the start of the discussion and ask, and is there a possibility of the corona crisis driving a secular change in car ownership patterns away from, families having one car per family or 0.7% cars per family by the time you average it out, and move towards carpooling or autonomous driving, where I don't know. Which is much more like a public transport model. Kai, tell us about what you see, what changes you see autonomous vehicles, autonomous driving bringing about, and then before we move on to the broader question.
Huge opportunities, of course, and whereas the area of powertrain change and electrification is largely a challenge to the existing value chain because it requires fewer people to produce an electric vehicle compared to a combustion engine vehicle. I think the whole discussion on increasing safety, automation, and fully automated new mobility offerings can really push the automotive industry forward and create jobs and safeguard employment in the EU. So where do we see the largest opportunities when it comes to automation? Full automation in terms of robo-taxis, we're still some time away from that. But already now we can bring so-called level 4 people movers to the roads. Level 4, what does it mean? It doesn't mean point to point. It means on a predetermined infrastructure or lane. So you essentially remove complexity. You can make the system learn this parcours, and then you can bring these fully automated little buses to the market already now. They are ready for these applications now. And yes, this will revolutionize also. It's part of the revolution of transport. We will rely less on individual car ownership. But even, when there is a revolution, some things don't fully change. So I think the revolution will mean more that we will have different ways of mobility. Car ownership in combination with public transport, fully automated vehicles, the taxis and Ubers of this world. So I see more coexistence of many rather than one replacing the other.
Okay.
Can I
Yeah.
make a few comments? First of all, I would say this, autonomous is not necessarily decarbonized. I believe there are autonomous cars driving around with cameras on their roofs and things, but are using internal combustion technology. Now, that is not the way forward. We've got to assume that these autonomous vehicles are also no-emission vehicles. I would wish that to be very much the case. Also, I think autonomous vehicles, if you imagine the world where they're be readily available on demand, they could generate further demand for car use by people perhaps who don't drive at the moment for whatever reason. They could be young children getting in a car and being taken to school, not driving themselves. So there could be scenarios where there's more traffic. And I think these are questions which we have to think about too. But what I would talk about, and what I would sort of link with the question is that, will you own a car in 2030? Well, I have a car and I typically keep them for 10 years. I'm just ordering a new one, and there's a certain delay in delivery because of the circumstances of today. But I think definitely if it's 2030, there will be legacy issues. And there'll be a lot of internal combustion engines still on the roads, if not in Europe, then elsewhere in the world. So I would have said by 2040, the world might be quite radically different. But the lifetime of a car is such that there will be a lot of internal combustion cars still in 2030, unless we do a sort of early scrappage sorts of incentives, which encourage people to switch technologies. But I think 2030 is really just round the corner, and we've got to think very carefully what can be changed in that time, because there are long lead times for many of these big transitions. If you take cars, it's I don't know how many years it takes to develop a car, but if you want aircraft, it takes, typically much longer, and the aircraft isn't used for as long as 30 years or more. And therefore, the changing of systems is always a very slow process.
Kai, from a business perspective, are you worried about there being a secular change in the level of car ownership? You could be facing a double whammy, couldn't you? There'll be disposable income, household disposable income will probably fall because taxes will have to increase as governments seek to reduce their deficits. I'm talking going out 2, 3, 4 years, but and at the same time, if there's a general public embrace of decarbonisation, that could be away from individual vehicle ownership. Are you planning on that basis?
So obviously, we are faced with a number of disruptions at the moment: electrification, digitalization, and automation. And the challenge for us, if we leave aside Corona now, is that we have to invest in these areas at the same time. And that's really the big challenge for the automotive industry. We need to fully go full steam ahead in electrification, in automation, and in data-driven business models. That is difficult to do that at the same time. Still, I think automation particularly offers many, many opportunities. When you think of safety technologies, cameras, sensors, the combination of sensors with previously stupid components. Think of the airbag. Yeah, very soon we will have cameras that detect if another vehicle is hitting your vehicle and then deploy an outside airbag to mitigate at the right moment. You will have cameras and sensors inside to see how you sit, and the way your airbags deploy and the way your seatbelts are pre-tensed will be specific to your seating situation. So many opportunities for safety. We should embrace that. Yeah, many opportunities to save lives, via automation, to make mobility more comfortable, more available. We're cutting a lot of costs, because one of the big challenges for public transport is to have to pay a driver who drives an empty bus. Yeah, and by replacing that driver, you dramatically reduce the costs of offering public transport. Now, is that good for always the number of cars? Maybe not, but that's how we should use technology to the benefit of society. And I think a lot of people in the automotive sector are investing exactly in these type of solutions. So yes, many challenges, but many opportunities.
Okay, Joanna, have we dealt with Mr. Vinoir's question? And are there other good questions there that you'd want to pull out on this topic?
Mr. Vinoir's question was more related to that, to highlight the waste flowing from the current model of individual car ownership, and what are the alternatives.
Highlight the?
Waste. element, how wasteful this is.
The lack of full utilization. So one person or two people in a car. Is that the question?
Yes.
Kai, you think you've kind of answered that, no? But I don't know if you have anything else to say, or Peter.
Sometimes I say, thank God we are all not fully rational human beings, because life would be pretty boring if we were. But from a fully rational point of view, yes, you could say, does everybody need to have a car? No. Do we need to have that extra spare room in the attic, in the house? No. Do we need a third pair of shoes? No. So we come very quickly to very fundamental questions that probably go beyond the seminar.
Yeah. Actually, maybe I can just ask one more sort of, Kai, you work for a German company, although with a global customer base. How do you see the rivalry between the traditional car makers, mainly German car makers in Europe at least, and new entrants like Tesla and even the car makers like Google? Are you does that worry you? Do you see an erosion of Germany's industrial leadership?
Yeah, so I think we have great customers in Germany, France, Italy, US, Asia. So really our customer base is global.
Sure.
If you just take the point of view of a supplier, let's assume you, Simon, today or decided to build a car tomorrow. And you don't have the necessary infrastructure, maybe expertise, history, engineering skills, etc. So whom do you turn to? I think you will look to some suppliers. So new entrants, to some extent, for suppliers are certainly no threat.
Right. Okay.
Interestingly, if I can make a parallel, right now, governments are commissioning ventilators, and indeed asking car manufacturers to start making ventilators. And this learning curve is clearly it's something that a lot of companies are going through right now. And it's interesting seeing that the incumbents who have made ventilators for years, of course, consider them state of the art, as I'm sure they are. And they're suspicious that new entrants might not make as good a ventilator as you need. Well, I think in cars it will be similar. I mean, there will be new entrants. Some of them will produce extremely good cars in a relatively short time. There'll be new companies emerging. So we're on the cusp of change, and we all remember how smartphones came in and replaced the previous models of phone. So, this is interesting times to be living through. But in all of it, we mustn't forget the long-term objectives that we're striving for, which are to be sustainable, to live in harmony with our planet, and carbon neutrality by 2050 is one of the very important provisos that we must at all times keep at the forefront of our minds.
Okay, that's a nice wrap, Peter. We're in the final 2 minutes of the debate. Joanna, just share with us, if you will, the results of the final poll.
So the final results they were very equal throughout when the poll was still going on. But finally, we have 41% of the audience says yes, they will own a car in 2030. 33% says no, and 25%, which is a high percent, says don't know yet.
Okay. Very good. Okay, well, that leaves it. Thank you very much for taking part today. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to everyone who joined us online. We